So the bar is raised pretty high tonight because not only did I promise my students that I wouldn't cry, but we have this great film crew here as well. Can you all hear me okay? No? Yes? All right. Okay, so I'm Ryan Mandell. I'm the area head of sculpture. Many of you I already know. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, giving me the opportunity to speak with you about my work. Primarily what I'm going to do tonight is tell you about a current research project entitled Shifting Utopia, Almere, the Netherlands. But before doing that, I wanted to give you a little bit of background to help frame the work, because I think many, if not most of you, are probably entirely unfamiliar with my work leading up to this project. As you can see, I just kind of reused, I gave this talk at the University of Kentucky almost exactly a year ago, actually, as it turns out. So I'm just kind of reusing that with some modifications because I had some Lexington, Kentucky specific slides in there that wouldn't be terribly interesting to you. This first image, I'm not going to talk about this just yet. I wanted to first kind of frame my art making practice by telling you a little bit about my upbringing, because I think having a good foundational story, it's of course important to be aware of where you come from and to think about how it affects your art making practice, but I think having a nice mythology also helps to build a level of mystique and allure. So I was born in South Florida, and I grew up in South Florida during a time when the landscape was transitioning from orange groves and farmland into gated communities and golf courses. And this really made an impact on me, watching the landscape transform in that way. Another formative experience was that my father was a partial owner and manager of a funeral home and a cemetery. And my family was not religious at all. We were, I would say atheist, but probably more like agnostic in that it just wasn't ever really brought up. So I had this very keen awareness growing up that my family's livelihood came from the death of other people. And I was always very much aware of the reality of death and the inevitability of death. And so I was grappling with these really existential questions very early on. According to my parents, I think when I was 8, they were tucking me in and I told them there was no God. I don't know if that's a true story or not, but I really like that. Let's see, I don't think I even really need to change the slide yet. I want to tell you a little bit more about where I started. This work that you're looking at now, this is actually from my, I was a graduate student at the time. This was 2006, so this is almost 10 years ago that I made this now. And this was in a solo exhibition that I had in Chicago at the, it was then called the Shop Gallery on Lake. It's now called Packer Shop, I think. But before I started making objects, before I started making sculptural objects, Nicholas mentioned that my undergraduate degree is actually in drawing. And I was a drawing major because they had the biggest studios at my ed. I don't know why that was, but drawing majors had the biggest studios. They were also extremely tolerant of a broad range and types of practice, and really thinking liberally about what could constitute a drawing. So I ended up doing a lot of installation-based work and really thinking about the experience of space as a kind of, as an art practice in and of itself. And so I was doing these really kind of minimal spatial gestures. Like, just to give you one example, I noticed that on the basement level, when people would flush the toilets, there was this phenomena called water hammer, where the plumbing kind of like throbs from the change in pressure. So I hung a series of bells and lights down the length of the hallway, so when anyone would flush a toilet, there would just be this cacophony of sound and light. And this was the kind of work that I was doing. And when I entered grad school, I was kind of working in a similar vein. And I had this moment where I realized that that work was not really doing what I wanted it to do when I created this installation in this exhibition venue in the sculpture building, where I had done some background research on the space, and I found, okay, this used to be a classroom. I found this historical photograph of the classroom with these children sitting at their desks, and there was a chalkboard, and there was this alcove space with these coats hung on this coat rack. And I looked around in the space, and this alcove was gone. but you could see a very faint line on the wall where the drywall had cracked. And so I thought, oh, there's this space back there, and I'm going to excavate it. So I meticulously removed the plaster, and then the lath, and then the framework, and I took them out, and I kind of arrayed them into the space like layers of an onion, and I had them suspended from the ceiling. And then I reclosed the opening with this translucent scrim, and I had an Arduino. Actually, Arduino wasn't out yet. It was like a little PIC chip with a photo sensor on it that would sense people coming into the room, and it would trigger these dimmer lights that would slowly come on. And in coming on, the screen would suddenly be backlit and therefore transparent, so you could see into it. And this space would reveal itself to you, and then it would fade away. And I thought this was a really moving and special piece. And there were people that had experience with the building that I think felt the same way, that they thought it was a powerful piece. There was this girl in Bloomington that worked at the coffee shop, and I just had this huge crush on her. And I would go in there, and I'd give her mixtapes and stuff. And she'd say, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm an artist. Oh, you should come see my work. So I pick her up from work one day, and I bring her to see my installation, this unbelievable installation. And I just thought, oh, she's just gonna be bowled over by this. So I bring her into the room, and I just see this look of like less than no acknowledgement whatsoever. She was just so completely unmoved by it, and I realized like this work is totally meaningless. In that moment, I realized this work is totally meaningless to anyone who doesn't have a pre-existing relationship, an intimate relationship with this space like I do, because this is the building where my studio is, and I'm here every day. And it just meant nothing to her. And so I realized that I wanted to make objects that could exist in their own right. I wanted to make work that was site responsive still, but I wanted it to have a life of its own and to have a content that was self-contained in the object, and that this object could travel to different venues and continue to be relevant, but still operate, that it wasn't tied to a place. I also knew that if I didn't stop making work like that, I was never going to get laid. So I started making objects like this. Actually, it was really good that it turned out that nothing came of it. I found out later that she was married. This is a close-up view of the same piece. This piece is called Intrastate, and as you can see, it's just kind of a scale model of an interstate exchange where the on and off ramps double back on each other, and so it creates this infinite loop that if you were traveling on, you would never leave. This piece is called Airports. This is two identical mirrored airports that interface. They kind of kiss at the orifice of the jetway. So you would move through this parking garage, through the terminal, down the jetway, and you'd go right back up another jetway and through another terminal into another parking garage that was identical to the one that you had just come from. And this show, it was called The Loop. And it was a kind of a play on that part of the neighborhood, and that gallery is in the West Loop. But I was also thinking about the nature of the commuter train as a train that's always traveling, but it's not really ever getting anywhere. It's circuitous. It's always just traveling in the same path. And at the same time, I was reading the theories of Marc Augé, who's an anthropologist, a French anthropologist. And he talks a lot about this idea of the non-place, which is a place that is devoid of character, and it's ubiquitous. It exists everywhere, and it exists in essentially the same form everywhere. And I thought about the strange irony of the best non-places I could think of were infrastructures for travel. And so there's this strange irony that you would travel in order to experience new things and to have a fresh perspective. But in traveling, you encounter these structures that are the same everywhere. So your first and last experience of any new place is going to be a structure that you're already essentially familiar with. I should back up a little bit too. I missed the part where I talk about my interest in the existentialists, because that really informs the work, and that helps to describe why I've gotten into making artworks that are influenced by architecture. The reason for that is an interest that I had in existentialists, but specifically in Martin Heidegger, because of this term that he coins of Dasein, which is being in the world. And I liked the idea that being doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Being happens in a context, and that that context informs existence. That existence is reliant on context. And this, to me, was a kind of exciting backdoor into being able to think about and understand existence by thinking about location, which to me seemed like something that was much more approachable and understandable than trying to grapple with just existence itself. That seemed insurmountable. So I thought, okay, this is the way that I'm going to come to terms with this atheist upbringing where I'm always thinking about death. I'm going to think about place, and that's going to enrich the way that I understand the nature of existence. Hence, this work that's all focused on urban planning and architecture. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that at the outset. This next series of work that I'm going to show you, I'm jumping forward a little bit. This is a series of photographs of digital images that are called the Dream Home series. And I've essentially made one of these everywhere that I've lived, except I haven't made one for Wisconsin yet. This first one is in South Florida. This one is called Bellagio, which is indicative of the kind of pretentious names that they give gated communities in South Florida. But basically what this series is, I go to communities where all the homes are essentially identical, and I drive through the community and I shoot photos of each house from essentially the same perspective. And then I use a software to average the visual information from each one of those images into a single image. And in that compilation, you see really just how identical they are. The slight discrepancies lead to an overlap that gives the works a kind of like misty, unfocused quality or a dreamlike quality. So there's a kind of pun intended there. But I also meant dream homes in the sense of the American dream as we understand it, which is that everyone have their own land and own their own home. And this work I think of as being a kind of sad work in that it realizes that not only do we have the same dream, but we all get the same home as well. And that this is a universal condition regardless of what region of the country you go to. So this is in Bloomington, Indiana. This neighborhood was called Gentry East, so that's the name of this piece. This is in Flower Mound, Texas. This is called Lantana. This one is from Pennsylvania. This is from just outside of Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. I actually don't recall it was some really convoluted long neighborhood name. I actually don't recall. It's like something Chicory Hills or I don't even remember. And this is from Boise, Idaho. So you can see that in each image, the vernacular of architecture changes. There are specific types of architecture that each region gravitates to. But then that theme is repeated over and over. This next piece jumps forward quite a bit. This piece is called Arks, as in Noah's Ark, but plural. I don't know why I started thinking about Noah's Ark, but I was thinking about this idea of a destruction of biblical proportions that would wipe out the earth and what would be left. And so I tried to imagine a kind of contemporary version of God's wrath, and I thought, okay, well, who would survive it? It would be the wealthy, basically, that would survive it because they would engineer their way out of it by paying for these homes that would be able to just float away when the floodwaters come. And they would be entirely unoriginal. They would be, each one would be essentially identical. They'd just be these modules floating, and they could kind of reconstitute communities as they liked, or you could get like the essential kind of eccentric, asocial, rich person who could float out on their own. This style of home is based on a certain vernacular architecture called the North Dallas Special, which I particularly like the name of because, it's a great name. But also the form itself is compelling because it has this almost gem-like quality. It almost looks like if you were to open up a geode, that this house is a kind of jewel. It's also particularly pretentious in that all of that space under the roof is entirely unused. It's all about adding to the height of the building for the sake of appearance. All of that is unusable space. So it's an entirely impractical way of building as well. So I hope that gives you kind of a sense of the type of work that I make and the kind of themes that I'm thinking about. I now want to transition into talking about this current research project of mine, Shifting Utopia. The project is based entirely in the Netherlands and specifically in a city called Almere, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment. But the foundation of this research and my interest in this project is in conceptions of utopia and the way that utopian ideals are attempted and at times arguably made manifest through architecture and through urban planning. The Dutch have a particularly rich history of pursuing utopia through the arts, and it begins with an artistic movement known as de stijl, which basically was at its height shortly after World War I. This is a group of thinkers, artists, designers, architects that were rallying around this idea of the domination of nature through human thought and inventiveness. And you see that very clearly in the work. One of the key components or proponents of the group was the architect Gerrit Rietveld. His works, you can see, are a kind of strict geometrical imposition on the landscape. It's a kind of overlay of human rationality in an organic world. This is his pavilion at the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands. And this is a commission for a family home. This is called the Schroeder House, and this is in Utrecht. Here's the interior. In addition, he was a furniture designer. So this kind of aesthetic and this sensibility and this want to distill and refine things to the point of the absolute minimum is a theme that runs through all of his production. Another really key player that you're all probably familiar with is Piet Mondrian. And in his work, you can see this idea of a kind of domination of nature through a system and through logic very clearly. Especially if you look at his early works, you can see this is a Piet Mondrian, one of his early paintings. It's really essentially a pretty straightforward landscape painting. As you look at his work through the years, you see very clearly this kind of breaking down and this distillation of the natural and the organic into a more regimented formula, to the point where he dispenses with curvilinear forms entirely. And eventually it gets to the point where he's imposed this absolute structure and arguably, I think he would say, a kind of purity and perfection to the form, paring it down to its absolute minimum. And you have to remember that this artistic movement, because it comes in the wake of World War I, Europe suffered through World War I such atrocities that there was such complete lack of faith in the way things were that there was a sense that the world as they knew it needed to be dispensed with, and that a new system needed to be created. So this is a kind of revolutionary, extremely idyllic practice that is attempting to cut ties with everything that came before and to imagine a brave, new, perfect utopian future. You can see the same evidence of this way of thinking on the actual physical Dutch landscape itself. These next few images are satellite imagery and aerial imagery of the Netherlands. And you can see the very same kind of imposition of the grid and the regimentation and the control that's exercised on the landscape in much the same way that the artists and designers of de stijl were working. This is partly, I think, because of a kind of aesthetic proclivity, but it's also due to necessity. Most of the Netherlands is at or below sea level. So the way that land is sustained or created is through an elaborate system of dikes, windmills, pumps, and canals in order to shuttle the water around and evacuate water out in order to create dry space or preserve dry space. Here's another kind of rudimentary diagram of how it all works. The windmill, which you think of as being like this iconic Dutch thing, that's why they have windmills, is the windmills were used as pumps in order to drive the water from low-lying areas. This is a really beautiful and articulate example of reclaiming and sculpting land from the sea. This is a medieval-era city named Naarden, where they've actually, essentially created a piece of land art in the act of reclaiming and securing this land from the sea. The city that my research is really focused on is this city, Almere, which is highlighted in red here. You can see it's just east of Amsterdam, and this large landmass that it's situated on is actually the largest artificial island in the world. The land that Almere is built on is less than 50 years old. So this city and even the land that it's on did not exist 50 years ago. It was just open sea. This is done, these are called polders, they refer to them as, these artificial islands. And the creation of the polders are, they're necessary in that they need more agricultural land, they need more land for housing stock. But it's also an opportunity. It's another opportunity to exercise control in the way that the Dutch traditionally have wanted to do and have done. And it's also, in building a landscape, there's then an opportunity to build the ideal society to inhabit that landscape. And they unabashedly claim that that is their intent to do so. One social geographer from the Netherlands named H.N. Terfeen said something to the effect that the polders should be populated with individuals based on characteristics like youth, health, and profession, which is scary kind of in how Aryan that sounds. But if you forgive him that, and you really look at what the underlying impetus is, it's really this belief that if we're going to build land, we can make this exactly what we want it to be. It could be a perfect society. We can choose the society that inhabits this landscape. Just for the sake of comparison, and it actually turns out they compare really well because they take up exactly the same square mileage, which was kind of a surprise to me. Notice that the population of Almere is about a third the population of Milwaukee. The interesting thing about Almere is that it is a proposition that is not yet fulfilled. One person that I interviewed at the International Newtown Institute that's headquartered there referred to Almere as hardware that's in place and that's just waiting for the software. So they've engineered a city that they imagine that they want, even though the need and the ability to actually fulfill it does not yet exist. So this is a city almost the size of Milwaukee, populated by a third of the population. So you can imagine that's kind of a disconcerting experience to move through an urban fabric that is so loosely populated. So although Almere has these utopian aspirations, what it's actually become is something much more nuanced and complex than that. And arguably, it has decidedly failed at being a utopia. And yet it tries in such really elegant ways at times. Just to give you a sense of how Almere stacks up compared to other Dutch cities, this is a photo of kind of a central square in the medieval city of Utrecht. And you can see it's a really, really nice. The scale of the urban fabric, everything is very diminutive. Everything is very crowded in. It feels, moving through the city feels like like a warm embrace. And the structures are extremely elaborate. They're imbued with this history and this warmth that comes with age. Almere, on the other hand, this is downtown Almere. So you can see that this is a pretty strong departure from the kind of traditions of Dutch urban planning. This is a plan that was developed by several superstar architects. The main city plan was developed by Rem Koolhaas, who is a really famous Dutch architect. This actual building that we're looking at in this image is called the Citadel, and it was designed by Sana, or it was Chipperfield. I don't remember which one right off the top. Oh no, Christian de Pont-Zemparc. There's so many architects. How can you remember them all? Christian de Pont-Zemparc is a really famous French architect. So they had this slew of famous and extremely successful Dutch architects, international architects, and they really just unleashed everything they had at trying to make this kind of landmark architectural icon of a city. This is a series of canal houses in Amsterdam. This is a street in Almere. And so you can see that they're trying to hang on to some of the same kind of vernacular qualities that Dutch architecture has, but it's an absurdity and it's ridiculous because these homes in Amsterdam are the way that they are because it was so important to have canal frontage because their entire economy was based on shipping via the canals. So everyone had to have access to the canal. So each one of these is incredibly thin so they can fit more of them along the canal, and everyone can have bay doors at the canal level so they can load their goods in and out and have a successful living. This neighborhood is nowhere near a canal, yet it tries to preserve that same kind of aesthetic of the many kind of thin buildings packed together. So what was done for function is now reduced to a kind of style, and it falls flat, and it reads as fake, and it reads as inauthentic. The result that this has had is that Almere, I think by virtue of its newness and its foreignness, but also by its falsity, has become extremely repellent to most native Dutch people. So they've had this really rabid advertising campaign. Almere is voor mij means Almere is for me. And they're just trying to pump it up, and they're showing you that anyone and everyone can live in Almere, and you can be wealthy, and you can be prosperous and happy. And the city is just littered with these pamphlets telling you all about Almere, what a magical place it is, and how the sky's the limit, and how it's a cultural hub, it's an architectural hub. It is multicultural. I'll talk more about that later. But really, there's no end to the kind of publicity that they try and generate in order to convince people of the merit of Almere and to move there. One interesting exhibition during the Rotterdam Architectural Biennial that took place in 2012, and this was during one of my first research trips there, there was a piece that was designed by the Dutch architecture firm MVRDV that was called Making Almere, Who Makes the City? And it was a kind of proposition about moving from a top-down driven form of urban planning where a select few planners decide what the city will look like to a more bottom-up approach where the inhabitants of the city make choices about the landscape that they live in, and they become designers of their own landscape. And this was really needed in that a lot of what you see in Almere is this incredibly austere, banal, and oppressive landscape. It's entirely mediocre. It's visually unpleasant, and it's already led. I mean, if ever there were evidence of the tie between society and the architecture that society inhabits, it is here. In that it's already led to a kind of a decline in the social fabric of Almere, and that it suffers from a lot of violence and a lot of theft and a lot of robbery, much more so than many other cities that are larger in the Netherlands do. So this project, one of the main projects, was called Play Oosterwold, and it was this idea, and I think an earnest proposal, that this area east of the city be developed entirely by the individuals who buy the plots of land. And so what they suggest is that everybody is they use the word undertaker, but it means like everyone's a developer. Like everyone's undertaking their own thing. And so they show you like, oh, even Yasin Yilmaz, the pizza chef, like he's going to buy his place and he's going to set up like a wood-fired pizza kitchen and he's going to live above it. And so they give you these theoretical bios of all these different people that are going to live there and build their place. And the premise is that you would buy the land and you would be responsible entirely for your own utilities, for your wastewater runoff, for your basically everything. You're like a pioneer. And there will be no municipal services. There won't even be roads until your area reaches a certain level of population density. And then the municipality will come in and they will make roads in order for you to get to your place. And so here they're giving you this kind of schematic of what you're responsible for in your plot. But inside of these responsibilities is also this freedom, in that you can do whatever you want. You could have like a greenhouse. You could have a karate dojo. You could have a daycare center. You can have your house there. You can do whatever you want. And they're saying you can do this by yourself or you can do it with other people. It's entirely up to you. Then notice that there's this little guy in the suit lurking down in the bottom corner. And what they're telling you is like, there will be oversight. There will be someone from the municipality watching. So, don't, just calm down. But they do follow that, and they say, okay, in Oosterwolde heb je de vrijheid om je droom te verwezenlijken, which means in Oosterwolde you have the freedom to realize your own dream. So it's exciting, It's like you can be a pioneer. You can go out, you can strike out, and you can do your own thing. You can realize your own dream here. And then in typical Dutch fashion, they systematically show you how you should realize your dream. With these very in-depth schematics of how your landscape should break down. And then they even give you these computer-rendered images of what your homestead will look like in the future while you're out there farming and get your wind energy going. So it's a very interesting city, and it's an interesting social experiment as well. And so some of the initial artwork that has come from this research was exhibited just over a year ago now at the D Center in Baltimore through the Institute of Contemporary Art there. It was a show called Fantasy, Reality, Utopia. And this is, it's earnest in that this is really what the work is about and what Almere is about, but it's also a play on the names of two neighborhoods and a district in Almere. They actually have these aspirational names in Almere. There's a neighborhood called Fantasy. There was a neighborhood called Fantasy 2, but then they were worried about, like if someone called 911 and said, oh, my house is on fire, where are you? Fantasy 2. They would think that they meant the second house at the first Fantasy and not the Fantasy 2 neighborhood. So then they changed. Fantasy 2 wouldn't work, so they went with reality. I don't know how they made that choice. So there's fantasy, there's reality, and then there's an island called Utopia, of all things. So these works are about those places in Almere. And this work was supported by Idaho Commission on the Arts Grant and a National Endowment for the Arts Grant. This first piece, many of you might have seen. This was in the faculty show last year. This is called Modern Dwelling 1. And in this series, there's two pieces in this series, in the Modern Dwelling series so far. And these are really based on an experience that I had in the fantasy neighborhood. I also made a video piece about this neighborhood fantasy. What the work is about really is the discrepancy between the ideal and the reality, or between the ideology of the architect and the need of the homeowner. And so in both of these works, what you see is a kind of idealized modernist structure defiled by some later addition. And it's defiled, but it's also entirely necessary in that it's an absence that needed to be addressed that wasn't addressed probably for aesthetic reasons. And so there's this disconnect between appearance and function and ideology and practice. And I wanted to show really the shortcomings of modernism and of utopian thought in that in being ideal, by very virtue of being ideal, it can't be practical. And so how do you reconcile the two? How do you preserve a dream for the future and a wish for a better future, full well understanding that dreams preclude practicality? And this next piece, this is Modern Dwelling 2, and this is a kind of riff on a Rem Koolhaas structure in which this kind of cheap OSB garage, two-car garage addition has been tacked onto it. And so I'm thinking a lot about materiality as well. In this first piece, the blue geodesic dome, it has this kind of authority and austerity and a kind of pristine quality. This is a resin finish that's been auto body polished. So it has the kind of the sheen and the reflectivity of a car hood. And then it's got this crass galvanized stovepipe stabbed into it with this roofing tar dripping from it. So I'm thinking about high and low materials as well. So here we've got this modernist architecture constructed of these high-end materials. This is solid ash, and then this cheap OSB structure scabbed onto the side of it. And there's no regard at all for a continuity of architectural style or architectural vision. It's really just kind of throwing appearance to the wind for the sake of function. And this was something that I experienced in reality, though to a lesser degree, in this neighborhood fantasy. what Fantasy was an architectural competition where they had, I think it was 13 lots, and they opened up the competition to architects anywhere could apply, and it was build your ideal dream home on this plot of land. And so they got all these submissions for all these architects' pipe dreams of what the best private dwelling would be, and they picked 13 winners. And they apparently picked those 13 winners with no regard for who the other winners were, because when you walk through this neighborhood, it's like this unbelievable collage of just these like ridiculous, over-the-top architect dreams that don't acknowledge their neighbors or the landscape even, really, at all. And the interesting thing, and you can kind of see it in this still here, is that there's clear evidence that these homes don't suit the needs of the people that live in them. Like here, you can see these people are hanging their laundry out in the yard, and then they've also put this kind of provisional, can you see the mouse? Yeah. They put this provisional like shed structure out here to store their stuff, probably because closets would have been unattractive in the house. In this video, I get a tour of the neighborhood from this woman that's pictured down in the bottom slide. She lives in Fantasy, and she's actually one of Almira's original town planners as well. So a really interesting personality. And the video, unfortunately, I don't have the video here, but I'll get it up eventually on my website, and you can just see it there. But her kind of frustration with the neighborhood becomes palpable over time. And she first talks very in a very I guess kind of convincing way that she believes that everyone should have their own choice and everyone should do what they want. And so what if it doesn't match the original architect's intent? You should be able to make your house what you want it to be. And then by the end of the video, you can see that she's really just kind of torn up by the fact that all of these ideal homes have been completely defiled by the new inhabitants. She thinks of her home as the one oasis in this neighborhood that hasn't been ruined. She's the only original inhabitant left from when the competition started. This other neighborhood, Reality, is a second architectural competition. They thought, oh, Fantasy's so great, let's do this again. And this time they said, well, we're not going to have people come in and mess up these architects' visions. They have to be absolutely preserved. But because the owners can't afford to do historical preservation, basically what you have is a graveyard of these rotting modernist homes. And you can see that pretty clearly in these stills. They're overgrown, they're rusting, they're falling apart. And so it's this graveyard of ideals. Utopia is a video of wandering through this faux natural environment on this island of Utopia, which is just this wooded island. It's a fake island made in a fake lagoon on a fake island in a fake sea that used to be the ocean. And the only architectural element on this island is a lookout tower, which I thought was really intriguing, that you make an island, you call it Utopia, and then you think, well, what kind of architecture should be on it, if any? A tower. Like a place from which you can ascend and then look down on those around you, was the way that I read it. And that there's this kind of elitism to elevation, to height, and a kind of power that comes from height. And that is what would constitute Utopia, would be the kind of control that's afforded through this height. So I made a companion piece, which I just realized I don't have a slide of it, called Ivory Tower. It was the very first slide. I'll pop back to it when we're through the presentation. But it's a piece that's designed in Rhino, and it's composed entirely of 2D parts. Rhino is a 3D modeling software. It's composed of 2D parts that plug together like a very basic kind of, almost like a Lego-like structure, almost like a IKEA furniture kind of structure. And it's this vinyl-coated MDF. So at first glance, it's imposing. It's about 15 feet tall. And it's white. It's this gleaming white thing, and it's a tower, so it has this kind of authority. But when you get up on it, you realize it's a cheap vinyl coating on MDF, which if you get it wet, just dissolves and turns into garbage. So it's this very cheap material that has this pretension of authority. And from the top of this tower is a projector playing video of the island Utopia, where I'm wandering through this fake wilderness along these paths that have been carved by teenagers that go there to do drugs and have sex. And then, moving through the stairwell of this tower where there's all this graffiti and beer cans and whatnot. So this project, as it moves forward, I've received some additional funding and support from the Arts and Humanities, the graduate school here, and also the Peck School of Art and Design, in order to continue this research. But moving forward, my eventual goal is that I elaborate on some of this work that I've already done, where I'm using walking and wandering or being toured through this environment as a kind of creative tool, and thinking about it along the same lines as the concept of the flaneur, which is developed by Walter Benjamin, but it was first posited by the poet Charles Baudelaire. And the idea is that the flaneur is like this dandy, this kind of an idler, a stroller who wanders through the urban fabric, and they let it wash over them, and this kind of passive experience of the urban environment becomes, in some way, a kind of creative endeavor, a way of understanding the world around you and letting it move through you, letting it soak into you. He elaborated on this project in a book called The Arcades Project. Interestingly enough, this is totally coincidental, there is a structure called the Passage in Almira, which looks quite a bit like the cover image from the Arcades Project, and it's actually pronounced like the French, passage, whereas if it were pronounced Dutch, it would be passage. So they're already thinking about this this kind of like French monumental ideal landscape as well in Almira. Again, the flaneur is this kind of dandy who wanders through the city, and this was imagined as a gentleman kind of wandering through Paris. But there's an interesting precedent for work like this, both in contemporary and historical art, where walking or wandering or following is thought of as a kind of generative process. This piece is by Richard Long, where he walks a line into the grass. This is a piece by Vito Acconci called Following Piece, where he follows random strangers in New York City. And this is a piece by Francis Alise, where he pushes a block of ice around Mexico City until it turns into nothing. And so the act of moving becomes a generative or a creative act, or at least an opportunity for a meditation about place. And there are more contemporary examples of this as well, which I will show in just a moment. My thinking is that by continuing some of the same practices that I've used in these previous video works, where I'm kind of wandering or moving through these different districts of Almira, I can combine this approach of the flaneur with contemporary technology by outfitting myself with a GPS transponder and recording locational data that could then be translated directly into G code, which is the code that moves CNC fabrication equipment. So positional data could be translated directly into, essentially for directions for a machine to cut form or to 3D print form. I have here just some kind of graphical representations of terrains visualized through data. And here are some images of different CNC equipment. This is a CNC router milling a 3D terrain. This is another CNC router milling a 3D terrain. And a 3D printer. So I kind of imagined this idea of moving through the space as generating a new alternate topography for Almira. And this work follows in the footsteps of artists like Evan Roth, who are doing motion tracking. This is a piece in which a graffiti artist's tag is motion tracked and then translated into a 3D object that exists in physical space. This is the work of Golan Levin, who created an algorithm to visualize speech. So the act of speaking made visible. And then our very own Nathaniel Stern, who performs images into being by moving through space outfitted with an augmented scanner. And this builds on a proclivity of the Dutch to map everything as well. Maps exist for everything in the Netherlands. They have transit maps. They have bicycle maps. They even have maps of the footpaths that exist in the city. So everything is mapped. But what I'm interested in is the ability of this technology to record travels that would record different kinds of dynamics. Not necessarily just physical dynamics, but social dynamics. One of the really fascinating things about Almere is because, I mentioned earlier that its newness and therefore its foreignness has made it repellent to native Dutch people. It's made it a magnet for immigrants because its lack of popularity has driven the real estate prices down. So immigrants that are of a lower economic standing are naturally just gravitating to Almere. And so it's become one of the cities in the Netherlands with the highest concentration of Muslim population. And so I'm interested in how that affects the urban fabric and what that does to distributions of municipal services. If I were to, for instance, say, walk a path where trash had or had not been collected, and would that in some way align with divisions of race or social standing or ethnicity? And this is a fascinating project not only for Almere, but also, I think, as something that could be exported and meditated upon in Milwaukee as well because of the extreme racial divisions that exist in Milwaukee. There's this extreme tension coming to a head in the Netherlands. There are some really volatile figures, namely this guy named Geert Wilders, you may have heard of. I think he burned a Quran, and he talked about the Quran as being like I forget the way that he characterized it, but I mean really just like hateful, ignorant stuff. This extreme xenophobia that's coming to the fore in the Netherlands because of heightened immigration. And so nowhere is that tension more evident than somewhere like Almere, where there is this strong immigrant population. So I think it makes an interesting case study in and of itself of how the urban landscape either does or does not facilitate a kind of racial integration, or what kind of society it does cultivate. And then those discoveries or those findings could also be exported here in order to think about the kind of divisions that exist in Milwaukee, why those exist, how those might be dictated by the landscape or by architecture, and how they might be addressed. That is essentially the end of my presentation, and I want to now make a shameless plug for my study abroad program, in which I bring students to Almere, and we live on houseboats. We live there. We also live in downtown Rotterdam. It's a 2-week-long program. We go to museums and galleries in all the major metropolitan cities. We meet with curators. We meet with artists, designers. What else can I tell you? The CIE, the Center for International Education, tells me it's one of the most affordable trips that they offer. So if you're interested in study abroad, it's a deal, apparently. The price up here, this is quoted for between 8 and 10 students, somewhere between $2,500 and $2,700. And that price includes the academic costs, so the 3 credits that you get. It includes your lodging. It includes your transit passes around the country, your museum passes to get into all the museums we go to, and all of your breakfasts. So you need additional money for your airfare, your lunches, your dinners, and to buy books and that sort of thing. So really, it's a steal. And it's a lot of fun. I did it last year with a small group of students. I also did it the year before that with a group from Boise State. I really enjoy doing it. I think the students have a positive experience. So if you're interested in this, please let me know. You can email me or you can approach me after the talk. I'm happy to talk about it more. And of course, I'm also happy to field questions about my own research and my own practice. So thank you for bearing with me through a, at times, disjointed presentation. But I'd love any questions you have. Thank you.